The Body Found Beneath Baker Street, a Sherlock Holmes Mystery. Chapter 1. The Collapse Beneath Baker Street. It has often been my habit, in setting down these reminiscences of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to begin with some small domestic scene at our lodgings before the storm of a case broke upon us. I shall depart from that custom now, for the matter I am about to relate began not with a visitor at our door, but with a sound, a deep, grinding rumble that shook the very foundations of the houses along Baker Street on a damp morning in the March of 1889. I had been at breakfast, reading the agony columns aloud to Holmes more for the pleasure of his occasional dismissive snort than for any hope of finding material of interest, when the floor beneath our feet gave a faint shudder as though some great beast had turned over in its sleep beneath London's pavements. The teacups rattled. Mrs. Hudson, ascending the stairs at that moment with a fresh pot, very nearly lost her footing. "An earth tremor," I suggested, setting down my paper. "In London," Holmes replied, without lifting his eyes from the chemical apparatus he had assembled at the corner of the table, a habit of his that perpetually tested the patience of our landlady. "Hardly, Watson. We are not built upon fault lines, but upon clay, gravel, and the optimistic excavations of the Metropolitan Railway Company. I should say a tunnel has given way somewhere close at hand, possibly the new spur line they have been boring toward Dorset Mews these past months. You will recall the company's engineers have been driving a connecting shaft beneath the older properties to link with the extension at Marylebone." He had scarcely finished speaking when we heard the clatter of running feet upon the cobbles outside, followed by a confusion of shouting voices. I crossed to the window and drew back the curtain. A small crowd had already gathered some 100 yards along the street, where a wooden hoarding marked the railway company's works, and more figures were converging from every direction, drawn by that universal magnetism which disaster exerts upon the curious. "Something has indeed happened," I said. "There are policemen already." Holmes was beside me in an instant, his thin face alight with that peculiar eagerness he reserved for the prospect of a genuine mystery, as opposed to the domestic trivialities that so often occupied his less satisfying days. "Then let us not be the last to learn what it is. Fetch your hat, Watson. I have a notion that breakfast may wait." We descended into a street transformed. The hoarding that had concealed the railway works for some weeks past had buckled inward at one section, and through the gap I could see workmen standing in attitudes of frozen astonishment around a ragged opening in the earth. Not the clean rectangular excavation of an engineered shaft, but a jagged collapse, as though the ground itself had given way into some older, hidden space beneath. A police constable, very young and very pale, was attempting without much success to keep the crowd back. Holmes produced his card and a few quiet words, and we were permitted through the barrier to where a stouter, older man in a foreman's coat stood wringing his cap between blackened hands. "We were driving the new connecting gallery, sir," the foreman explained, in answer to Holmes's first question, "same as we've done all along this stretch, when the boring crew struck what they took for ordinary rubble. Old foundations, you understand. Half this street was built and rebuilt a dozen times since the last century. But when the timber props went in and the lads cleared back the spoil, they found—" He stopped and swallowed visibly. "Well, sir, they found there was a room down there, a cellar, bricked up entire, with no door nor stair that anyone living remembers. And inside it, there is a body," Holmes finished for him quietly. The foreman nodded, unable for a moment to speak further. I confess that even I, who had by then accompanied Holmes through a considerable catalogue of London's more grotesque crimes, felt a chill at those words that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. A man entombed in secret beneath one of the busiest streets in England, undiscovered until the relentless progress of the age's engineering had, quite by accident, prized open his hiding place. There was something in the image that struck at the imagination with peculiar force. "How long has this cellar lain sealed, would you say?" Holmes asked the foreman. "That I couldn't tell you, sir. There's no record of it on the company's surveys. The old apothecary's shop stood above this ground until it was pulled down for the works some 18 months back, and I'll wager whatever's down there has been hidden a good deal longer than that. A police whistle sounded from within the works, and a moment later a familiar figure came scrambling up out of the excavation, brushing brick dust from his sleeves, with an expression of profound distaste for the indignity of subterranean labour. It was Inspector Lestrade, and the sight of his sharp, ferret-like face turning toward us across the rubble told me, before he had spoken a single word, that we had arrived at the threshold of a case that would occupy us for some time to come. "Mr. Holmes," he called out, with that peculiar mixture of irritation and relief with which he so often greeted my friend's appearance at a scene of crime, "I rather thought you'd not be far behind, given it's happened practically on your own doorstep. You had better come down and see this for yourself. I've handled a good many unpleasant things in my time, but I don't mind telling you, this one has a queer feel to it that I can't put a name to." Holmes's eyes had already taken on that distant, calculating brightness I knew so well. "Lead on, Lestrade," said he. "I rather think the queerness of it is precisely why we are here." And so, within the hour of finishing my breakfast tea, I found myself descending a makeshift ladder into the gloom of an excavation beneath Baker Street, with no notion whatever of the tangled and patient wickedness that awaited discovery in the darkness below, nor of how far that darkness would lead us before the truth of the matter was brought, at last, into the light. Chapter 2. A Caller from Scotland Yard. I should explain, before proceeding further, that Lestrade's appearance at the excavation that morning was no coincidence, but the result of a message sent some 20 minutes earlier to Scotland Yard by the railway company's own superintendent, who had the good sense to recognise that a body discovered under such circumstances was a matter for the police rather than for his own engineers. By the time Holmes and I reached the bottom of the makeshift ladder, Lestrade had already taken a preliminary survey of the chamber, and it was at his invitation, indeed, at his evident eagerness, that we now stood at the threshold of the sealed cellar itself. But I anticipate myself. Before we descended, there occurred a small exchange between Holmes and Lestrade that I record here, for it illustrates as well as anything I might write the peculiar manner in which my friend's mind operated even in the most unpromising of circumstances. "You have come up from the yard in some haste, I think," Holmes observed, as Lestrade emerged briefly to confer with the foreman. "And you have had words with Inspector Gregson this morning, unpleasant words, by the set of your collar." Lestrade turned upon him with the particular scowl he reserved for such observations. "Now how the devil could you know that, Mr. Holmes? I have said nothing of Gregson since I arrived. Your collar is fastened a button higher upon the left than the right, which suggests it was refastened in haste and irritation, very likely after having been seized by the lapel, a gesture Gregson is known to favour when making a point he considers important. There is also a faint trace of cigar ash upon your right cuff, of a particular cheap blend that I happen to know is favoured exclusively among the inspectors of the yard by Gregson himself, who smokes incessantly while lecturing his colleagues. You did not, I think, have time to brush it away before this matter called you out." Lestrade's mouth opened and closed once before he recovered himself sufficiently to mutter, "It was a difference of opinion regarding the Hammersmith forgery case, if you must know. Nothing to do with the present business. But I observed that he eyed his own cuff with some suspicion thereafter, and brushed at it self-consciously, before leading us down into the works. This small demonstration, trifling as it may appear upon the page, served its purpose admirably, for it restored in me, and I dare say in Lestrade also, however he might have denied it, that particular confidence in Holmes's faculties which is so essential when one is about to be confronted with something genuinely perplexing. We had need of that confidence within the minute, for the sight that greeted us in the lantern light of the buried cellar was perplexing indeed. The company's surveyors had no record whatever of this chamber, Lestrade said, as we picked our way across loose brick and timber, shoring toward the gap in the earth. It does not appear upon any plan of the old apothecary's premises that stood here, nor upon the plans of the building before that, so far as the company's archivist has been able to discover. Whoever sealed this room wished it to remain entirely forgotten, and in that, at least, they very nearly succeeded, Holmes murmured, for the better part of 2 years, by the look of the dust upon the brick. We came at last to the breach itself, a ragged opening perhaps 4 feet across, through which the workmen's lanterns cast a wavering, sulphurous light into a small chamber beyond. I confess that I hesitated a moment upon the threshold, for there is something in the close, earthen smell of a long-sealed space, mingled with that other, fouler odour one learns to recognize after years in medical practice, that strikes a primitive note of dread, quite independent of reason. Holmes, however, showed no such hesitation. He stepped through the gap with his lens already in hand, and I followed close behind, my black bag, fetched, at Lestrade's request, before we had even left Baker Street, held ready for whatever grim examination might be required. The chamber itself was small, no more than 8 feet square, walled entirely in old brick, that showed, even to my unpractised eye, 2 distinct periods of construction, an older course, blackened with age and damp, and a newer one, paler and more regular, which formed the wall through which the workman's boring had broken. It was this newer wall, I would come to understand, that held the key to the whole tragic business, though at that moment my attention, like Lestrade's, was drawn entirely to the huddled shape that lay against the far corner of the room. "Good God," I said, very quietly, and knelt beside it. Chapter 3. The Sealed Cellar. The remains, for I cannot in honesty call them anything so whole as a body, though they retained, owing to the extraordinary dryness of the sealed chamber, a far greater degree of preservation than I should have expected after so long an interment, lay upon their side in the corner, the limbs drawn up in an attitude that might have been natural collapse, or might have been deliberate concealment. The clothing, though discoloured and in places decayed, was unmistakably that of a man of some respectability, a dark broadcloth coat of good quality, a waistcoat with a watch chain still threaded through its buttonhole, though the watch itself was missing, and boots of a style I judged to be perhaps 3 or 4 years out of fashion. "A gentleman, or one who dressed as such," I said, beginning my examination with the caution the circumstances demanded. "Male, I should say between 30 and 40 years of age, of middling height and slight build. The hands show no callousing of the kind one associates with manual labour. This was a clerk, or a professional man of some description." "Cause of death?" Lestrade asked, hovering at my shoulder with his notebook already out. I made what examination I could in that poor light, and found, upon turning the skull with great care, a depression at the back of the cranium consistent with a single heavy blow. This, I think, though I should want better light and more time to be entirely certain. A blow from behind, delivered with considerable force, sufficient to cause death, or at the least to render the victim incapable of resistance before whatever followed. Holmes, meanwhile, had been occupied not with the remains themselves, but with the chamber that contained them, moving along the walls with his lens held close to the brickwork, pausing here and there to scrape a fragment of mortar into a small envelope, or to examine, with that intensity of focus that excluded the entire world beyond the object of his attention, some mark or stain that meant nothing whatever to my own eyes. "Holmes," I said, somewhat impatiently, for I had grown accustomed over the years to a certain theatrical delay in his methods, that I confess occasionally tested my patience. "Have you nothing to say of the man himself?" "A great deal, when I have finished saying what the room itself has to tell us, which is rather more in this instance." He straightened, brushing brick dust from his knees, and came to stand beside me over the remains. "Observe the coat, Watson. What do you make of the buttons?" I examined them as he indicated. Small, dark, of a horn composition, with a faint maker's mark pressed into the underside of each. Unremarkable, surely. A common enough style. Common, yes, but not, I think, so very old as the rest of the garment would suggest. Compare the wear upon the buttonholes, which shows considerable use, consistent with a coat worn daily for some years, against the buttons themselves, which show almost none. A man does not habitually replace the buttons of an old coat unless they have been lost or damaged, and I see no sign of damage to the cloth around them to suggest such a repair was necessary. It is a small thing. I merely note it for the present. And the key? Lestrade put in, for it was he who had first noticed it, a small brass key of the flat, double-toothed pattern used by safe deposit companies, clutched so tightly in the dead man's right hand that the bones of the fingers had closed about it like the claw of some long-dead bird. Holmes took the key with evident interest, turning it beneath his lens. This, I think, will prove a more direct path to the truth than the brickwork, though we shall want both before we are finished. There is a number stamped upon the shank. See here, Watson, 371. A deposit box key, beyond question, and one that has not been long in this man's possession when he died, for the brass shows almost no wear upon the teeth. You said the brickwork had something to tell us, I reminded him. It has told me a great deal already, though I shall keep my conclusions to myself for the present, if you will permit me, Lestrade. Not from any wish to be theatrical, but because a half-formed theory, spoken aloud before its evidence is complete, has a regrettable tendency to colour the manner in which subsequent evidence is gathered. I should rather we proceeded with open minds. He glanced toward the small fragment of paper that Lestrade's constable had discovered, half crushed beneath the body, and which now lay upon a handkerchief spread across an upturned brick. What is that? It proved to be a torn corner of a ledger page, the ink faded but still legible under Holmes's lens, a column of figures, and the fragment of a name that had been torn through its middle, leaving only the letters Eve visible above a sum that I made out, with some difficulty, to read £12,000. Reeve, Lestrade said slowly, and I saw a change come over his sharp features, as though some memory long dormant had stirred at the sound of the name. Mr. Holmes, I believe I know who this is. Chapter 4. The Clerk Who Vanished. We adjourned, by mutual and unspoken consent, to the comparative comfort of a public house, some streets distant from the works, where Lestrade, over a glass of brandy that he plainly required more than he would have admitted, related to us the history that the torn ledger fragment had recalled to his mind. It must be the better part of 2 years ago now, he began. In the autumn of '87, there was a clerk at the Caledonian and Provincial Bank on Threadneedle Street, Jonathan Reeve was his name, who vanished one evening after the bank had closed and was never afterwards seen or heard from. Within a week it was discovered that some £12,000 was missing from the bank's reserve, in notes and securities that Reeve, as senior clerk with access to the strong room, was in a position to have removed. The conclusion drawn at the time, and I confess I had a small hand in the investigation myself, though it was Inspector Forrester's case in the main, was that Reeve had absconded with the funds, very likely to the continent, and the matter was never satisfactorily resolved, though a watch was kept at the ports for some months. And the figure upon this fragment? Holmes inquired. £12,000. The very sum. There can be little doubt, I think, that this is the unfortunate Reeve we have found beneath Baker Street, though how he came to be there, bricked into a cellar not a quarter-mile from where he supposedly fled the country with a fortune in stolen notes, is a question I confess defeats me entirely. It rather defeats the theory of his absconding altogether, I observed. A man does not flee to the continent and end his days murdered in a cellar off Baker Street. Unless, Lestrade said, brightening with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has seized upon the solution to a difficult problem, he never fled at all, in the sense supposed, but was killed that very night by some confederate, an accomplice in the theft, perhaps, who saw a richer prize in eliminating his partner and keeping the whole £12,000 for himself. That would explain both the body and the missing funds in a single stroke. It would explain a great deal, Holmes agreed, with a mildness that I had learned, over years of association, to regard with some suspicion, were it not for two small circumstances that I observed in the cellar, and which I confess I have not yet fully reconciled, even in my own mind. I shall say no more of them at present, save this, that the wall through which the workmen broke this morning is of considerably more recent construction than the older brickwork surrounding it. Newer, I should judge, by a matter of months rather than years. If Reeve was murdered and sealed into that chamber on the night of his disappearance in the autumn of '87, I should expect the brick that entombs him to show the same age as that disappearance. It does not. Lestrade frowned. You're suggesting he wasn't put there until later. I am suggesting only that the evidence of the brickwork and the evidence of the popular theory do not, at present, agree with one another, and that where such a disagreement exists, it is generally wiser to trust the brick than the theory. But this is a matter for patient inquiry, not for hasty conclusion. Tell me, who besides the bank itself had cause to take an interest in Reeve's disappearance? Had he family, a wife? No wife, that I recall, though there was talk of an attachment, a young woman to whom he was understood to be engaged, though I cannot now bring her name to mind. As for the bank, the manager at that time was a Mr. Aldous Pemberton, who took the loss very hard, as I recall, and was most active in pressing the police to recover the stolen funds. He holds the same position there to this day, I believe. Then I think, said Holmes, setting down his glass with an air of quiet decision, that our first call must be upon Mr. Pemberton, and our second upon whatever remains to be discovered of the young woman to whom poor Reeve was engaged. A man does not vanish from the world for 2 years, even one bricked into a cellar, without leaving some thread by which the patient inquirer may draw the whole fabric of the truth back into the light. Watson, I think we shall want your notebook as well as your medical bag before this matter is concluded. I confess that as we rose to leave the public house, I felt the particular thrill of anticipation that I had come to associate with the opening movements of one of Holmes's investigations, a sense that beneath the ordinary surface of London's commerce and courtship, a darker pattern was waiting to be traced, thread by patient thread, to its hidden and most likely tragic source. Chapter 5. The Manager of Threadneedle Street. The Caledonian and Provincial Bank occupied a solid, unimaginative building of grey stone on Threadneedle Street, its facade conveying, as such institutions invariably strive to convey, an impression of permanence and unshakable solvency that I have observed to be in inverse proportion, more often than not, to the actual security of the funds within. We were shown, after a brief delay, into the private office of Mr. Aldous Pemberton, who rose from behind a broad mahogany desk to greet us with a manner I can best describe as carefully composed. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, of comfortable build, with iron-grey hair brushed back from a high forehead, and the particular smoothness of feature that comes to men who have spent a lifetime cultivating the trust of others as a professional asset. His handshake was firm, his voice well modulated, and his eyes, I noted this particularly, for Holmes had taught me long ago the value of such observations, moved across our faces with a swiftness that suggested he was assessing, even as he welcomed us, precisely how much we already knew. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I had a message from Inspector Lestrade not an hour ago, informing me of this dreadful discovery, he said, gesturing us to chairs. I can scarcely credit it, even now. Poor Reeve, murdered, and lying all this time not half a mile from this very office. It is a ghastly business. You identify the remains as Jonathan Reeve with some confidence, Holmes observed, though I understand the body itself is not as yet in a state to permit easy recognition. The ledger fragment, surely. The fragment bears a partial name and a sum that corresponds to the funds reported missing at the time of Reeve's disappearance. It is suggestive, certainly, but I had wondered whether you yourself entertained any doubt of the matter, or whether the identification seemed to you, from the first moment you heard of it, entirely beyond question. Pemberton hesitated, and I saw a flicker of something, irritation perhaps, or simple discomfort, cross his composed features before he answered. I suppose I assumed it, Mr. Holmes, given the location and the circumstances. Who else should it be? That is precisely what we hope to determine. Tell me of Reeve himself. What manner of man was he? Capable, ambitious, in a quiet way. He had been with the bank some 9 years, and had risen to the position of senior clerk with responsibility for the strong room and the daily reconciliation of accounts. A position of considerable trust, which I confess I extended to him perhaps too generously, given what followed. Pemberton's voice took on a harder edge. On the evening of the 14th of October, 87, he remained at his desk after the other clerks had departed. As was not unusual for him, being a conscientious worker, he was never seen again. Within the week, our internal audit discovered that £12,000 in notes and bearer securities had been removed from the strong room, to which he held one of only 2 keys, the other being my own. You held the other key, Holmes said, with no particular emphasis, though I saw Pemberton's hand, resting upon the desk, tighten very slightly. I did, and do still, Mr. Holmes, and I submitted to a most thorough examination of my own conduct by the bank's directors at the time, as you may well imagine, given the obvious suspicion that attaches to any man who holds such a key. I was cleared entirely. My own accounts were found in perfect order, and I had, moreover, been at my club until past midnight on the evening in question, as a dozen witnesses can attest. A most fortunate alibi, Holmes murmured. A true one, Mr. Holmes, whatever you may choose to read into my fortune. There was an edge to Pemberton's voice now that had not been present at the start of our interview. I lost a great deal in this affair, the trust of my directors, very nearly my position, and £12,000 of the bank's reserve that I have spent 2 years attempting to see restored, with no success whatever, until this morning's grim discovery raised the matter from its grave, quite literally. Was Reeve a man of expensive habits? Debts, perhaps, that might explain a theft of such magnitude? None that I was aware of. He lived modestly, so far as I knew. Lodgings in Camden Town, no extravagances that came to my attention. He was, I believe, engaged to be married to a young woman of respectable but unmoneyed family, which I had always understood to be a steadying influence rather than a financial burden upon him.
Her name?
Mallows. Eliza Mallows. I believe she kept a small millinery establishment, or was employed in one, somewhere in the vicinity of Camden Town, though I have had no occasion to think of her these 2 years past. Pemberton rose, in a manner that suggested he considered the interview concluded. I shall be glad to assist the police in any way I am able, Mr. Holmes, but I confess I do not see what further light I can shed upon the matter. Reeve stole the bank's money, and it would appear, from this morning's grim discovery, that someone repaid him for the theft in the most final coin available. Whoever that someone was, I devoutly hope you find him, for the bank's £12,000 remains, so far as I am aware, entirely unaccounted for. As we descended again into the bustle of Threadneedle Street, I turned to Holmes with some eagerness. Well, what did you make of him? A man of considerable self-command, Holmes replied thoughtfully, who has rehearsed this account of events so many times, to so many inquiring parties, that it now emerges from him with the smoothness of a stone worn by years of running water. That alone proves nothing against him, Watson. An innocent man, having told a true story 100 times, will tell it just as smoothly as a guilty man rehearsing a false one. But I noted that his hand trembled very slightly when I mentioned the second strong-room key, and that he was rather quicker to supply Miss Mallows's name and situation than a man who claims not to have thought of her in 2 years has any right to be. We shall want to speak with her ourselves, and soon. Chapter 6. The patience of Miss Mallows. We found Eliza Mallows at her place of employment, a small but respectable millinery shop in Camden Town, its window dressed with bonnets of the current fashion, arranged with evident care upon stands of white-painted wire. She was a slight young woman of perhaps 27, with fair hair drawn back beneath a plain cap, and a face that might have been pretty had it not worn, even before we had spoken a single word to her, the settled and weary patience of one who has long ago ceased to expect good news from strangers who come asking after the past. She received us in a small back room, amid bolts of ribbon and half-finished frames, and listened to Holmes's careful explanation of the morning's discovery with a stillness that I found, in its own way, more affecting than any outward display of grief could have been. "You believe it is Jonathan," she said at last, very quietly. It was not a question. "We cannot yet be certain," Holmes replied, with a gentleness I had not always observed in him when dealing with witnesses of lesser sensitivity, "but the circumstances make it probable. I am sorry to bring you such news in so abrupt a fashion, Miss Mallows, but I must ask you some questions if you are able to bear it, for the sooner the truth of this matter is established, the sooner whatever justice remains to be done can be accomplished." She nodded, her hands folded very tightly in her lap. "I have waited 2 years to know what became of him, Mr. Holmes. I think I can bear a few more minutes of waiting, if it brings me closer to an answer at last. You did not believe, then, that he had fled the country with the bank's money?" "Never." The word came with a sudden, fierce conviction that startled me. Whatever the bank chose to believe of him, and whatever the newspapers were content to print, I knew Jonathan Reeve, Mr. Holmes, and he was not a thief. He was careful with money, to the point of carefulness being almost a fault in him. He would not spend a shilling on a cab fare if a half-hour's walk would serve, for he was saving every penny he could toward our marriage. A man who counts his omnibus fares so closely does not suddenly vanish with £12,000 and leave the woman he loves to face the world's suspicion alone. "And yet he did vanish," I said, as gently as I could manage. "He did, and I have asked myself every day since what became of him, and found no answer that satisfied me, until this morning." She drew a steadying breath. "There is one thing I have never told the police, Mr. Holmes, because I did not know what to make of it myself, and feared it would only deepen the suspicion against him. Some 3 weeks after he disappeared, I received a letter." Holmes's stillness took on a new and concentrated quality. "From Reeve?" "It purported to be. It was written in his hand, or a very passable imitation of it, and told me that he had been obliged to leave England suddenly, on business connected with the bank, that he could not explain, and that I was to wait for him, and trust that he would send for me when it was safe to do so. It bore a foreign postmark, Brussels, I believe, and I clung to it for many months as the only proof I had that he was alive. But the years passed and no further word came, and the letter itself—" She hesitated. "What of the letter itself, Miss Mallows?" "I came, in time, to doubt it. The hand was very like his, but not, I thought, quite right in certain particulars. The manner of forming his capital letters, which I knew intimately from 100 small notes he had written me during our courtship. I told myself I was being foolish, that grief and uncertainty were playing tricks upon my judgment, but I never quite believed in that letter again, once the doubt had taken root, and I have wondered, every day since, whether someone else wrote it, someone who wished me to believe Jonathan had fled, when in truth he had not fled at all. Do you still possess this letter?" "I do. I could not bring myself to destroy it, whatever my doubts." She rose and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, returning with a single sheet, much creased from long handling, which she placed in Holmes's outstretched hand with the reverent care of one surrendering a relic. Holmes studied it for a long moment beneath his lens, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts, while I watched Miss Mallows's pale, composed face and reflected upon the particular cruelty of her uncertainty stretched across 2 years of a young woman's life. At length Holmes folded the letter with great care and placed it within his breast pocket. "I should like to retain this, Miss Mallows, if you will permit it. I believe it may prove a good deal more important than either you or its writer ever intended. You think someone wrote it to deceive me?" "I think," said Holmes, with the particular gravity he reserved for moments when he was unwilling to commit himself to a conclusion before the evidence was complete, "that this letter, and the man who composed it, may together tell us a great deal about what truly became of Jonathan Reeve, and that the answer, when we find it, is unlikely to be the simple tale of theft and flight that the world has been content to believe these 2 years past." Chapter 7. The Locksmith's Ledger. Our next inquiry, conducted upon Holmes's instruction the following morning, concerned the construction of the cellar itself, a matter that brought us, by way of the railway company's archives and a half-day's patient inquiry among the surviving tradesmen of the district, to the door of a small workshop off the Edgware Road, where a builder and locksmith named Silas Crane plied his trade among a clutter of half-finished ironwork and the smell of hot metal. Crane proved a wiry, weathered man of late middle age, with the permanently narrowed eyes of one who has spent a lifetime peering at close work in poor light, and a manner that shifted, over the course of our interview, from a guarded reticence to something I can only describe as nervous evasion. "The old apothecary's cellar, you say?" he repeated, when Holmes had explained the purpose of our visit, wiping his hands upon a rag with rather more thoroughness than the task required. "Aye, I did some work there, 2 years back or thereabouts. Bricked up an old archway that the owner said was unsafe. Subsidence, he told me, and likely to bring the floor above down into it if it weren't sealed. Common enough job. I do a dozen such in a year." "And who engaged you for this work?" Holmes asked. "A solicitor's clerk, acting for the owner. Tully, his name was Josiah Tully, of an office in Gray's Inn Road. I never met the owner himself. Such matters are commonly arranged through an agent, in my experience, and I had no cause to think it irregular." "You found nothing within the cellar at the time you sealed it? No furnishings, no occupant of any kind?" Crane's eyes flickered toward the door of his workshop, as though calculating the distance to it, before returning to Holmes's face. "There was some old furniture down there, sir. A broken table, some shelving. I was told to leave it be and brick over the lot, which seemed to me a deal of trouble over nothing, but a man doesn't ask too many questions when he's paid promptly and in full, which Mr. Tully's clerk saw to most punctually." "Why do you ask after a 2-year-old job, Mr. Holmes? Has something come of it?" "A body has been discovered within that cellar, Mr. Crane, the remains of a man named Jonathan Reeve, who has been missing these 2 years past." The colour drained visibly from Crane's weathered face, and the rag fell from his hands unnoticed to the floor. "A body," he repeated, in a voice gone suddenly thin. "I knew nothing of anybody, Mr. Holmes, I swear it before God. I bricked up an empty cellar, or one I believed empty. There was no smell, no sign of—" He stopped, pressing the back of his hand against his mouth. "And yet you hesitate," Holmes said, with quiet but unmistakable pressure, as though some memory troubles you that you have not yet given voice to. Crane was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance, before he spoke again, more slowly. "There was one thing, sir, that I've thought on now and again these 2 years, though I never thought it worth troubling anyone with. When I came to do the work, the clerk who let me in, Tully's man, was most particular that I should finish the whole job within a single day, and that I should bring my own materials rather than use what brick was already to hand in the cellar itself, of which there was a fair stock left over from some earlier repair. He said the old brick wasn't sound. I thought it queer at the time, paying for fresh material when good brick stood ready to hand, but it weren't my business to question a paying client's preferences. Did you ever return to that building after the work was completed? Once, some months later, perhaps the spring following. I couldn't swear to the precise month. I had occasion to pass that way and saw that further work had been done about the property. New guttering, and a section of the rear wall repointed, though I'd had no hand in it myself. I recall thinking it odd that a building due, as I'd understood it, for eventual demolition by the railway company should be receiving such careful attention in the meanwhile. But London is full of landlords who throw good money after bad, in my experience, and I gave it no more thought than that. Holmes's expression, as we took our leave some minutes later, had settled into the particular stillness that I had learned, over years of observation, to recognize as the outward sign of some significant conclusion taking shape within his mind. He said little as we walked, until we had gone some considerable distance, when he remarked, almost to himself, "It grows clearer, Watson, though not yet clear enough to act upon. A solicitor's clerk who insists upon haste and fresh material, where old would serve as well. Further work undertaken upon the property some months after the cellar was first sealed. A letter written in a hand that deceived a grieving woman only until her doubt had time to mature. Each of these, taken alone, is a trifle. Taken together, they begin to suggest a pattern altogether different from the one that Scotland Yard, and the newspapers, and even Mr. Pemberton himself, have been content to accept these 2 years past. You suspect Pemberton, then? I suspect, at present, only that the truth of this matter is considerably more patient and more calculated than a simple theft and flight, and that whoever constructed it has taken great care, over a long period, to ensure that the world believed precisely what it wished to believe. That is not the work of a man fleeing in panic with stolen money, Watson. That is the work of a man who has had ample time and ample reason to plan. Chapter 8. A discrepancy in the brickwork. It was 2 days later, after Holmes had spent the better part of both in inquiries he conducted largely alone, a circumstance I had grown accustomed to over our long association, though it never entirely ceased to provoke in me a certain professional curiosity, that he returned to our lodgings on Baker Street, bearing a small parcel of brick fragments and mortar samples, which he proceeded to arrange upon the table with the meticulous care of a man laying out evidence for a jury. I have spent the morning at Somerset House and at the offices of 2 brick manufacturers in Battersea, he announced, settling into his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man whose patient labour has borne fruit, and I believe I am now in a position to say with some confidence, when the newer wall of that cellar was constructed, and the answer, Watson, is considerably more significant than I had even hoped. You found a date stamped upon the brick itself. Better than that, I found the manufacturer. The fragments I gathered from the cellar wall bear a maker's mark belonging to Catford and Sons, a firm in Battersea that produces a particular pressed brick of distinctive composition. I called upon them this morning, and was able, with a little persuasion, to examine their order books. This precise variety of brick, Watson, was not first manufactured until the early months of 1888, a full 4 months after Reeves' disappearance in October of 87. I sat forward, the significance of this striking me at once. Then the cellar could not have been sealed on the night Reeve vanished. It could not. The wall through which the railway workmen broke was constructed no earlier than the spring of 1888, which is to say, some 4 to 6 months after the official date of Reeves' disappearance and the theft of the bank's funds. And recall, if you will, the matter of the buttons upon his coat, which showed almost no wear, despite the considerable use evident in the buttonholes around them. I have made some inquiry into that small detail also, and find that the particular style of horn button in question was first introduced by its manufacturer, a firm supplying gentlemen's outfitters throughout the city in the closing months of 1887. A coat may certainly be fitted with new buttons at any time, but taken together with the brickwork, Watson, I believe these 2 trifles point toward a single, inescapable conclusion: that Reeve did not die on the night he disappeared. That he did not. I believe, Watson, that Jonathan Reeve was alive for some considerable period after the world had given him up as a fugitive, alive in hiding, perhaps under some constraint or arrangement we have not yet discovered, and that his coat was repaired or refitted with new buttons at some point during that hidden period, before he was finally murdered and sealed into that cellar some months after his presumed flight, once whatever purpose his continued concealment had served was no longer required. I confess that the cold deliberation implied by this theory struck me with considerable force. Then the letter Miss Mallows received was very likely composed, Watson, not to cover a flight that had already occurred, but to sustain the fiction of a flight that had not, to keep the world, and most particularly Miss Mallows herself, from making any inquiry that might have disturbed an arrangement that someone wished to preserve for some months longer. I have examined the letter closely. The hand is a careful imitation, skillful enough to deceive a casual eye, but Miss Mallows's instinct was sound. Certain capitals, particularly the formation of the letter R, betray a hand other than Reeve's own, schooled in imitation, but not perfect in it. Then who wrote it? And why keep Reeve alive at all, if the intention was always to murder him eventually? Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking out upon the grey bustle of Baker Street, with an expression I had come to recognise as the prelude to one of his more searching deductions. That, Watson, is the very question upon which the whole structure of this case must turn. Consider, a man disappears, accused of a theft of £12,000. If he is in fact innocent of that theft, if the funds were taken not by Reeve, but by some other party who arranged matters so that suspicion would fall upon him, then that other party would have every reason to wish Reeve removed from circulation immediately, to prevent his protesting his innocence. But removing him by simple murder, on the very night of the theft, carries a substantial risk. A body discovered too soon, before the fiction of his flight had taken firm root in the public mind, might unravel the entire scheme. Far safer surely to persuade Reeve, by threat, by some hold over him, or perhaps even by a promise of eventual reward, to remove himself quietly from view for a time, to corroborate by his absence the theory of his own guilt, while the true thief consolidated his position and ensured that no inquiry would ever look beyond the convenient and already accepted explanation. And once that purpose had been served, once Reeve's continued existence, hidden though it was, had become a liability rather than an asset to whoever held him in that arrangement, there would remain only the final, brutal step of ensuring his permanent silence. "It is a monstrous theory," I said, "but I confess I can see no flaw in its logic. Nor can I as yet, though logic alone does not convict a man in a court of law. We require evidence that will bear scrutiny, and I believe, Watson, that the key clutched in poor Reeve's dead hand will furnish us with precisely that, once we have traced it to its source. I propose we visit, tomorrow morning, every safe deposit establishment in the city whose box numbers run as high as 371, beginning with those nearest to Threadneedle Street. Somewhere among them, I am persuaded, we shall find the resting place of £12,000 that has lain untouched and unsuspected for very nearly 2 years. Chapter 9. The Death of Silas Crane. We had scarcely begun our inquiries the following morning, having visited, by 10 o'clock, no fewer than 3 safe deposit companies without success, when a message reached us at Baker Street that altered the entire complexion of the case. It came from Lestrade, delivered by a breathless constable, and consisted of a single urgent line requesting our immediate attendance at an address in the vicinity of the Edgware Road, the very street, as I recognised with a sinking heart, even before we arrived, upon which Silas Crane kept his workshop. We found the locksmith's premises already surrounded by a small knot of constables, and Lestrade himself standing in the doorway with the grim expression of a man who has seen a case grow suddenly and unwelcomely heavier. "Crane is dead, Mr. Holmes," he said, without preamble. "Found this morning by his apprentice boy, lying in the yard behind his workshop. The boy thought at first he'd had a fall, for there's a nasty wound to the back of the head consistent with striking the stone paving, but the surgeon who examined him before you arrived was not satisfied that the injury was accidental, and nor, I confess, am I, given what you told me yesterday of your interview with the man. I felt the particular chill that comes when a theory still forming in the mind is suddenly and brutally confirmed by events. Holmes's face had gone very still, and I recognized in it not surprise, but a kind of grim self-reproach that I understood only too well, knowing him as I did. "I should have foreseen this," he said quietly, as we made our way to the small yard where Crane's body had been found. A man who has begun to recall inconvenient details of a job he performed 2 years ago, and who does not trouble to conceal his unease at being questioned about it, makes a very poor confederate to keep silent, and a very tempting candidate for permanent silencing should the party who originally employed him come to suspect that his memory has grown too clear. The examination of the body, which I conducted with Lestrade's surgeon at my elbow, confirmed what I had already begun to fear. The wound to the back of Crane's skull, while it might at first glance have suggested an accidental fall against the stone paving of the yard, showed upon closer inspection a regularity of shape inconsistent with such an explanation, a depression too clean, too evenly distributed, to have resulted from an unguided collapse. "He was struck," I said, "and struck deliberately, by some smooth, heavy implement, I should guess at an iron bar, or something of similar character, of which I dare say this workshop contains a dozen examples. The blow was delivered, I think, from behind and slightly above, suggesting an assailant who either surprised him while he stooped to some task, or who stood upon some slight elevation when the blow was struck." "Robbery?" Lestrade suggested, though without much conviction. "There's a cash box in the workshop that's been disturbed, though whether anything of value was actually taken, the apprentice cannot say with certainty." "A disturbed cash box," Holmes observed, "makes a most convenient explanation for a death that some party wished to appear unconnected with anything beyond a common burglary gone wrong. I do not believe it for a moment, Lestrade, and I think when you have heard the full account of our inquiries these past days, you will share my doubt." He proceeded then to lay before Lestrade, with the same patient clarity he had shown to me the previous evening, the whole pattern that had emerged from the brickwork, the buttons, the forged letter, and now this second and most violent confirmation of his theory, that Jonathan Reeve had been kept alive in hiding for some months after his presumed flight, that someone had taken great care to maintain the fiction of his guilt during that period, and that Crane, having grown troubled by his own half-formed memories of the cellar's ceiling, had become a danger that the same someone could not afford to leave unaddressed. Lestrade listened with the particular frown of a practical man confronted with a theory more elaborate than he would have constructed himself, but one whose logic he could not readily dismiss. "If you are right, Mr. Holmes, and I do not say you are not, then we are looking for a man who has shown extraordinary patience and extraordinary ruthlessness in equal measure, 2 years of careful concealment, and now a second murder to protect the first. That is no common thief panicking after a theft gone wrong. That is something a great deal colder." "It is," Holmes agreed, "and I believe, Lestrade, that we have already sat across a desk from the man most likely to possess both the patience and the ruthlessness this scheme has required. But suspicion, however well-founded, is not proof, and Mr. Pemberton is not a man who will be brought to confession by suspicion alone. We must find the box that key opens, and we must find it before our quarry has cause to suspect how close we have drawn, or I fear we shall lose not only the evidence we seek, but very possibly the man himself, to flight or to some further and more desperate measure." Chapter 10. Holmes among the fog. The days that followed were among the most singular I had spent in my long association with Sherlock Holmes, for he conducted himself throughout them with a restlessness and an apparent disorganization of method that I had rarely observed in him at any previous stage of an investigation, however perplexing. He came and went from our lodgings at all hours, often without explanation, returning sometimes before dawn with his boots caked in mud, from districts I could not always identify, and saying little of where he had been or what he had discovered. "You are concealing something from me, Holmes," I said to him one evening, when he had returned from some expedition with a tear in his coat sleeve and a distracted, inward-turning expression that I found, in a man ordinarily so composed, faintly alarming. "I have not seen you in this state of mind since the affair of the Brixton tragedy, years ago now." "I am concealing nothing that I have yet succeeded in proving, Watson, which is a very different matter from concealing a settled conclusion." He sank into his chair and was silent for some moments, his long fingers steepled before his face in the attitude of concentration I knew so well. "I have visited 11 safe deposit establishments in the city these past 3 days, Watson, and at not one of them have I found a box numbered 371 corresponding to any account that bears the smallest connection to Jonathan Reeve, or indeed to anyone of that name. I begin to suspect that the box, whatever it contains, was rented not under Reeve's name at all, but under some other identity entirely, which would account for our difficulty in tracing it, but which also closes off the most direct avenue I had hoped to pursue. Then we are no closer to proof than before. On the contrary, Watson, we are a great deal closer, though by a path I had not anticipated. I called this afternoon upon Carrington's Safe Deposit Company on Cornhill, an establishment I had previously overlooked owing to its somewhat exclusive character. It deals chiefly with gentlemen of established credit, rather than the general public, and I had not thought a clerk's stolen fortune likely to find its way into so respectable an institution. But I found, upon inquiry, that box number 371 at Carrington's has stood rented these 2 years past under the name of a Mr. Joseph Marsh, who has visited the box on no more than 4 occasions in all that time, the last of these being some 7 months ago. I felt the particular thrill of a long search drawing toward its conclusion. "And this Joseph Marsh, have you seen him? Can he be traced?" "I have not seen him, for he conducts his business at Carrington's entirely by appointment, arranged in advance by letter, and the clerks there could furnish me with no description beyond the vaguest generalities. A gentleman of middle age, well-dressed, unremarkable in manner. But I asked, as a matter of routine, to examine the signature he provides upon each visit for the company's register, comparing it against examples of handwriting I had taken the precaution of gathering these past days from certain other sources. He paused, and there was, beneath his evident fatigue, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "The hand of Joseph Marsh, Watson, and the hand of Mr. Aldous Pemberton, as displayed upon a dozen routine letters and memoranda, I obtained without difficulty from the Caledonian and Provincial Bank's own correspondence files, share a quite distinctive habit in the formation of the lowercase j, a small looped flourish that I have observed in no other hand among the several dozen specimens I have now examined. It is not by itself conclusive proof that would satisfy a court of law, but it satisfies me entirely as to where the truth of this matter lies. Then Pemberton is Marsh. He hid the stolen funds under a false name, in a box his own bank's investigation never thought to seek, because no one imagined the thief to be the very man who pressed hardest for the thief's discovery. Precisely so, and I believe, moreover, that I now understand the purpose behind the strange instructions given to Silas Crane regarding the building above that cellar. The freehold of the old apothecary's premises, Watson, was purchased some 18 months before Reeve's disappearance by a solicitor acting for an undisclosed client, the very Josiah Tully whose clerk engaged Crane's services. I have this afternoon obtained, through means I shall not trouble to detail, a sight of Tully's client ledger for that period, and the client in question, recorded there under a designation intended to preserve his anonymity even from his own solicitor's permanent records, can be traced through the pattern of payments to no other source than Aldous Pemberton himself. He purchased that building secretly, Watson, fully a year and a half before he had any apparent reason to require it, which tells us that this scheme was no sudden improvisation following a moment's temptation, but a design laid with extraordinary patience, long before poor Reeve ever vanished from his desk. I confess that as Holmes related this chain of discovery, I felt a chill quite distinct from the autumn damp pressing against our windows, the chill of recognizing, at last, the full and patient malice of the man we had so recently sat across a desk from, listening to his smooth and well-rehearsed account of grief and loss. "What remains to be done?" I asked. "What remains, Watson, is the most delicate part of the whole undertaking. We have assembled, between brick and button, letter and ledger, signature and secret freehold, a structure of evidence that I believe to be true in every particular. But Pemberton is no fool, and a man who has maintained so elaborate a deception for 2 years will not be easily startled into confession by an accusation, however well-founded, that he can simply deny. We must, I think, give him cause to act, to betray himself by some movement we can observe and that the law can seize upon, rather than rely upon words alone to convict him. And for that, Watson, I believe a certain degree of theatre will be required, of precisely the kind in which you have so often, and so patiently, indulged me." Chapter 11. The New Clerk at the Counting House. The plan that Holmes proceeded to lay before me over the following 2 days was, in its essential conception, a simple one, though its execution demanded a patience and attention to detail that I had come to expect from him in such matters. If Pemberton could not be persuaded to confess by confrontation, he might yet be induced to betray himself by alarm, and the surest means of alarming a man who believes his secret safely and permanently buried is to suggest, by whatever means, that the ground above that secret has begun, quite literally, to give way. To this end, Holmes resolved upon 2 simultaneous courses of action. The first required him to gain entry, under an assumed character, to the daily life of the Caledonian and Provincial Bank itself, in order to observe Pemberton at close quarters and to satisfy himself upon certain remaining points of detail before the final movement of the case was set in motion. The second, of which I shall speak in the following chapter, concerned a more direct provocation, calculated to draw Pemberton into action of a kind that no amount of smooth rehearsal could disguise. I confess I had some misgivings when Holmes first explained the manner of his intended disguise, for he proposed nothing less than to present himself at the bank as an applicant for a junior clerical position recently advertised, a post that had, as it happened, become vacant through the retirement of an elderly employee, and which Holmes had ascertained, through careful inquiry, remained unfilled. "You cannot seriously propose to enter Pemberton's employ, Holmes," I said, when he first outlined the scheme. "The man interviewed us himself not a week ago. He will recognize you the instant you walk through the door." "He will recognize Sherlock Holmes, certainly, were Sherlock Holmes to walk through that door," he replied, with the particular relish he reserved for the construction of a disguise. "But I have no intention of presenting Mr. Pemberton with that gentleman's acquaintance. I have spent a most instructive hour this morning with a quantity of grey powder, a pair of false side whiskers of regrettable but effective quality, and a stoop of the shoulders that I have found, in past undertakings, to add a convincing 15 years to my apparent age. I shall present myself as a Mr. Edward Forsyth, a clerk of long but undistinguished service at a private bank in Leeds, recently come to London upon the death of an aunt, and seeking a quieter situation than my previous employment afforded, owing to a delicacy of health that I shall be at pains to mention at every suitable opportunity." I could not, despite my misgivings, suppress a smile at this description, for I had seen Holmes effect transformations of appearance over the years that had deceived even those who knew him well, and I had little doubt that a man who had met him only once, across a desk, in the ordinary attitude of a consulting detective, would find nothing in the stooped and grey-whiskered Mr. Forsyth to recall that earlier encounter. The disguise proved, when I saw it completed 2 days later, every bit as effective as Holmes had promised. He presented himself for the position with a sheaf of forged but entirely convincing references, the product, he assured me, of a single afternoon's careful work with pen and ink, and was engaged, after the briefest of interviews conducted not by Pemberton himself, but by a subordinate clerk, to begin his duties the following Monday. It was from this vantage, a modest desk in the outer office, occupied with the dull but useful business of copying ledgers and sorting correspondence, that Holmes spent the better part of a week observing Pemberton's daily habits and bearing with a closeness that no outside inquiry could ever have achieved. He reported to me each evening, with the particular satisfaction of a naturalist who has succeeded in observing some elusive creature in its native habitat, the small details that accumulated, day by day, into a portrait of a man living under a strain that his outward composure could not entirely conceal. He visits the strong room alone, Watson, far more often than the ordinary business of the bank requires, Holmes told me on the fourth evening of his employment, having shed the grey whiskers of Mr. Forsyth for the comfort of his own dressing-gown and pipe. And I have observed upon 2 occasions now that he keeps within a locked drawer of his private desk a small bundle of correspondence that he consults briefly and with evident agitation before locking it away again with unusual care. I have not yet had opportunity to examine its contents, but I do not think I flatter myself in supposing that it relates, in some fashion, to the very arrangement we have spent these past weeks unravelling. You believe he suspects that the discovery beneath Baker Street threatens him. I believe he can scarcely think of anything else, however smoothly he continues to conduct the bank's ordinary business before his subordinates. A man does not maintain a secret for 2 years without developing, in that time, an instinct for danger that no amount of outward composure can entirely silence. I think, Watson, that the moment has very nearly arrived to test that instinct, to give Mr. Pemberton a reason to believe that his secret is not merely threatened, but actively unravelling beneath his feet, and to observe what action a man in such a state of alarm will take when he believes himself, for a brief and crucial interval, entirely unobserved. Chapter 12. The Letter from a Dead Man. The second and more decisive element of Holmes's plan was set in motion on a Thursday evening, some 10 days after our first descent into the cellar beneath Baker Street, and it involved an instrument that I confess struck me, upon first hearing of it, as bordering upon the macabre, though I had learned, over years of such collaboration, that Holmes's methods, however unconventional, were invariably calculated with a precision that left little to chance. "We are going to write a letter, Watson," he announced, "from a dead man." I confess I started at this. "You cannot mean to forge a communication from Reeve himself." "Not from Reeve as he was, Watson, but from the fact of his discovery, which serves our purpose every bit as well, and with rather less moral discomfort than impersonating the dead. Consider, Pemberton believes, or has believed these 2 years past, that every thread connecting him to Reeve's disappearance was severed long ago, the false letter to Miss Mallows accepted, the secret freehold concealed behind Tully's discretion, the deposit box hidden under an assumed name, and Crane, who knew the most dangerous fragment of the truth, silenced beyond any further indiscretion. He believes himself secure, Watson, however much the recent discovery of the body must have shaken that security. We are going to disturb that belief a great deal further." The letter that Holmes composed that evening, after several discarded drafts, was a masterpiece of calculated suggestion, purporting to come from an anonymous party who claimed to have been an associate of Silas Crane's, and who professed to have come into possession, through the locksmith's private papers, of certain particulars regarding the true history of the cellar's construction, particulars that the writer proposed to communicate to the police, unless a sum of money, considerably smaller than £12,000, was paid in a manner to be specified by return. "You intend this as a blackmail demand," I said, reading the draft over his shoulder, "calculated to provoke Pemberton into believing that Crane left behind some confederate or written record that survives him. Precisely so. A man who has already murdered once to protect his secret, and a second time to silence a witness whose memory had grown too clear, will not receive such a letter with anything resembling calm. He will be driven, I believe, to one of two courses, either to attempt some further and more desperate act of suppression, which we shall be watching for, or, and this is the outcome I consider more probable, given the particular phrasing I have employed regarding Crane's private papers, to retrieve and destroy whatever remaining evidence he believes might corroborate such papers, before any blackmailer or any policeman has opportunity to discover it independently. And what evidence do you believe he still holds that he has not already destroyed? I believe, Watson, that somewhere within the unfinished tunnel workings beneath Baker Street, in some recess or hollow that the railway company's boring has not yet disturbed, but which lies close enough to the original cellar that Pemberton can reach it without undue difficulty, there remains concealed some portion of the original £12,000, or some written record of the scheme's true history, that he has not dared remove since the body's discovery, for fear of being observed in the very vicinity that has become, this past fortnight, the centre of so much police attention. A man cannot simply walk into a heavily guarded excavation in broad daylight to retrieve a hidden cache, but a man sufficiently alarmed by the threat of exposure may attempt it under cover of darkness, when he believes the works to be unwatched. The letter was delivered the following morning by a method Holmes had arranged to leave no trace of its true origin, and the effect, when it came, exceeded even Holmes's careful calculation. I learned of it that same evening, when Holmes, still in the guise of the stooped and grey-whiskered Mr. Forsyth, though he discarded the disguise the moment we were alone, returned to Baker Street in a state of suppressed excitement that I had rarely seen him display so openly. He left the bank an hour before his usual time, Watson, with an agitation he could not entirely conceal even from his own clerks, who remarked upon it among themselves in the outer office where I sat, copying ledgers with every appearance of dull attention. I followed him myself, at a discreet distance, as far as the omnibus stand on Cheapside, where I lost him in the evening crush. But I do not think it matters, for I am now entirely persuaded of where he intends to go, and when. Lestrade must be informed at once. I believe Mr. Pemberton will attempt this very night, or tomorrow's, to return to the scene of his crime, and we must be there, Watson, hidden and waiting when he does. Chapter 13. The Trap in the Tunnel Lestrade. When Holmes laid before him the substance of our intentions, required rather less persuasion than I had anticipated, for the murder of Silas Crane had evidently settled in his own mind any doubts that might otherwise have lingered regarding the soundness of Holmes's theory. He arranged, with the quiet efficiency that I had come to respect in him over years of association despite our occasional differences with his methods, for a small party of plain-clothes constables to take up positions about the railway works that very evening, concealed among the timber hoardings and spoil heaps, in such a manner as to command every approach to the cellar without themselves being visible to any party arriving under cover of darkness. It is a damp, miserable business, watching an empty hole in the ground through a London fog, Lestrade remarked, as we settled into our own concealment behind a stack of timber props, some 20 yards from the excavation's main entrance. The gas lamps of Baker Street reduced to faint, smeared halos by the thickening mist. I hope your theory proves sound, Mr. Holmes, for my sergeant will have a deal to say if we stand out here all night for nothing. I have rarely felt more confident of a conclusion, Holmes replied quietly, though I grant you the waiting is a trial to the patience. A man of Pemberton's temperament does not act rashly, even under provocation, but neither will he leave so dangerous a matter unattended for longer than necessity demands. If he comes at all, I think he will come tonight. We waited, in that particular cold and clinging silence that a London fog imposes upon even the busiest of thoroughfares, for the better part of 2 hours, during which I had ample opportunity to reflect upon the strange and patient cruelty of the case we had pursued. upon Jonathan Reeve, hidden away and finally murdered for the convenience of another man's greed, and upon poor Crane, whose half-formed memories had cost him his life for no greater crime than an honest unease he had been foolish enough to express aloud. It was a little past 11 o'clock when Holmes's hand closed suddenly upon my arm, and I followed the direction of his gaze to where a single figure, muffled in a heavy coat and moving with the particular furtive haste of a man who believes himself unobserved, had emerged from the fog at the edge of the works and was making his way, with evident familiarity, toward a section of the excavation some distance from the main breach where the body had originally been discovered. "There," Holmes whispered, "he goes not to the cellar itself, but to the older gallery beyond it, the original passage, I should think, by which access to that chamber was once obtained before it was sealed entire. Quietly, now, Lestrade. We must take him in the act, with whatever he comes to retrieve still in his hand, or his solicitor will make a very pretty argument that he came merely to view, in grief, the place of his old clerk's death." We followed at a careful distance, our footsteps muffled by the same fog that concealed our quarry's movements, until we saw him pause before a low, half-collapsed archway some yards beyond the main excavation, a remnant, I supposed, of some still older cellar belonging to a building long since demolished, and kneel before it, working with evident urgency at a section of loose brick that yielded, after a few moments' effort, to reveal a dark cavity behind. "Now, Lestrade," Holmes said, and stepped forward into the lamplight that one of the constables had unshuttered at his signal. The figure at the archway started violently and turned, and I saw, even through the muffling fog and the inadequate light, the unmistakable features of Aldous Pemberton, his composed and respectable countenance transformed by shock and fear into something far older and far less controlled than the smooth bank manager who had received us so calmly across his mahogany desk a fortnight before. "Mr. Holmes," he began, and then, seeing Lestrade and the constables closing about him on every side, seemed to recognize in an instant the futility of any explanation, and made instead a sudden, desperate lunge past us toward the deeper darkness of the unfinished tunnel beyond, a flight that carried him perhaps 30 yards into the gallery before the passage narrowed and ended, quite abruptly, in a wall of raw, unbored clay that the railway company's engineers had not yet had occasion to penetrate. He turned there, trapped between the advancing lanterns of the constables and the blank earth at his back, and I saw the last of his composure drain from him entirely, leaving behind only the haggard, cornered expression of a man who understands, in a single terrible moment, that 2 years of patient and careful deception have come, at last, to their inevitable end. "It is over, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said quietly, advancing with the small bundle of papers that the bank manager had dropped, in his flight, beside the broken archway. "I think you had better come with us now, and tell Inspector Lestrade whatever you wish him to know, before the law tells the rest of it for you." Chapter 14. The Vault of Lies. It was in the comparative warmth of Lestrade's office at Scotland Yard, some hours later, with Pemberton seated under guard, and the bundle of papers retrieved from the old archway spread upon the table before us, that Holmes consented at last to lay out, for Lestrade's benefit and my own, the complete chain of reasoning by which he had unravelled a deception 2 years in the making. "The papers Pemberton sought to retrieve tonight," Holmes began, indicating the bundle, "consist, as I had supposed, of a written record, kept, I imagine, against some future need to remind himself of details he dared not commit to any more accessible form, detailing the disposition of the stolen £12,000, together with several drafts, in Pemberton's own unmistakable hand, of the letter later sent to Miss Mallows in imitation of Reeve's writing. He kept these things hidden in the old gallery rather than destroy them outright, I believe, from the same instinct that causes so many clever criminals to retain some small record of their own cleverness, a vanity almost, in the completeness of the deception, which in the end provided us with the very proof his arrest required. The scheme itself, Lestrade, began not with Reeves' disappearance in October of '87, but considerably earlier, with Pemberton's secret purchase, through his solicitor Tully, of the old apothecary's freehold some 18 months before. I believe Pemberton had already conceived, by that date, his intention to embezzle a substantial sum from the bank's reserves, and had begun preparing a place of concealment for both the funds and, should it prove necessary, for any inconvenient witness to the theft. Reeve, as senior clerk, held the second strongroom key and was therefore in a position either to discover Pemberton's scheme or to be made to appear responsible for it. I believe, though this portion of my reconstruction rests upon inference rather than direct proof, that Reeve did indeed discover some irregularity in Pemberton's accounts, and rather than report it immediately, attempted to use that knowledge to his own advantage, perhaps seeking a share of the proceeds or simply his silence purchased at a price. This was his fatal error, for it gave Pemberton both the opportunity and the justification to remove him from circulation under the guise of theft, rather than expose his own crime by reporting Reeves' attempted extortion. On the night of the 14th of October, I believe Pemberton persuaded Reeve to remain hidden for a time, perhaps under threat of immediate exposure as an accomplice, perhaps under promise of eventual payment, very possibly both, while the theft was completed and the blame allowed to settle upon Reeves' absence. The forged letter to Miss Mallows was composed to sustain this fiction during the months that followed, months in which Reeve remained concealed, very likely within that same cellar beneath the old apothecary's shop, sustained and controlled by the very man who had engineered his ruin. But concealment of a living, resentful man cannot continue indefinitely, and I believe that some time in the early months of 1888, corroborated, as I have already explained to Dr. Watson, by the brick manufacturer's records and by the introduction date of the buttons found upon the body, Pemberton determined that Reeve had become too dangerous to keep alive any longer, whether through some attempt at renewed extortion or simply through the accumulating risk of his continued existence. He murdered him within that very cellar and engaged Silas Crane, through the intermediary of Tully's clerk, to seal the chamber permanently, taking the precaution of insisting upon fresh brick rather than the older material already to hand, so that no observant eye might later notice so curious a discrepancy as the one which, in the end, betrayed him. And Crane's death, Lestrade asked. A simple matter of expedient self-preservation, once Crane's evident unease under our questioning suggested to Pemberton, who, I have no doubt, kept himself informed through some discreet channel of the progress of our inquiry, that the locksmith's memory had grown dangerously clear. A man who has murdered once to protect a fortune of £12,000 will not hesitate long before murdering a second time to protect his own neck from the gallows that the first murder would otherwise earn him. Pemberton, who had sat throughout this entire recitation, in a silence broken only by his ragged breathing, lifted his head at last, and I saw in his face none of the smooth composure with which he had first received us, but only the exhausted defiance of a man who knows that further denial has become useless. "He would have ruined me," he said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "Reeve discovered the irregularity in the foreign exchange accounts within a fortnight of my beginning it, and came to me not to report it, but to demand half of whatever I had taken, and a continuing share of whatever I might take thereafter, or he would expose me to the directors that very day. I had a wife, Mr. Holmes, and 2 daughters not yet provided for, and I tell you I did not set out that October evening intending murder, only to silence him long enough to see the worst of the storm pass, and to remove temptation from his reach, before it could grow into something I could no longer control. But a man who has tasted blackmail does not easily relinquish it, and by the spring he had begun to demand more than I could safely give without discovery. I did what I did, Mr. Holmes, because I saw no other path remaining to me, though I do not ask you to believe that excuses it." "I do not believe it excuses it in the slightest, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes replied, with a coldness I had rarely heard him direct at any man, however guilty. "For whatever pressure Reeves' extortion placed upon you, it does not begin to answer for poor Crane, who asked nothing of you beyond honest payment for honest work, and who died simply because his conscience had begun, at long last, to trouble him over a job he had performed in innocent good faith." Chapter 15. The Reckoning Pemberton's Trial, which followed some weeks later at the Old Bailey, attracted a considerable degree of public attention, owing in no small part to the singular circumstances of the case's discovery, and I shall not weary the reader with a full account of proceedings that occupied the better part of 3 days, and that ended, as the weight of evidence Holmes had assembled made all but inevitable, in a verdict of guilty upon both counts of murder. I attended the trial myself on each of its 3 days, and observed throughout it a curious transformation in the prisoner, who had entered the dock with something still of his old composure intact, but who, as witness after witness, the brick manufacturer's clerk, the safe deposit company's manager, the handwriting expert Holmes had engaged to testify upon the forged letter, and at last Holmes himself, giving evidence with the same patient clarity he had shown in Lestrade's office, laid before the jury the complete and damning architecture of his deception, seemed gradually to diminish before our eyes, until by the trial's final hour he sat slumped and grey, a man from whom all pretense had finally and irrevocably been stripped away. The sentence, when it came, was death, though I understand from Lestrade, some weeks later, that an appeal upon certain technical grounds had been lodged by Pemberton's counsel, and that the matter would not be finally resolved for some months to come. Whatever the ultimate outcome of that appeal, I confess I felt no great inclination to follow its progress closely, for the essential question of the case, who had murdered Jonathan Reeve, and why, and what had become of the bank's stolen fortune, had been answered with a completeness that left little room for further uncertainty, however the law's slower machinery might continue to grind. Of the £12,000, some £9,000 was recovered from the deposit box at Carrington's, rented under the name of Joseph Marsh, sufficient to satisfy the bank's directors that the worst of their loss had been retrieved, though the remaining £3,000, I understand, was never traced, and I have sometimes wondered, in the years since, whether some further concealment remains undiscovered, in some corner of London, that the relentless excavations of the age have not yet thought to disturb. Eliza Mallows received, some months after the trial's conclusion, a letter from Holmes himself, for he had taken, I noticed, an unusual degree of personal interest in the resolution of her particular grief, beyond what the strict requirements of the case demanded, informing her of the complete circumstances of Jonathan Reeve's death, and assuring her, with whatever comfort such assurance could provide, that the man she had loved had been no thief, but rather the unwitting victim of a scheme considerably darker and more patient than the simple theft the world had been content to believe of him. "She wrote back to thank you most warmly," I told Holmes some weeks later, having had the matter from Lestrade, who maintained a kindly, if irregular correspondence with the young woman thereafter. "She says the knowledge that Jonathan never truly abandoned her, whatever cruelty was visited upon him, has brought her a measure of peace that 2 years of uncertainty never could. It is, I think, the only genuine consolation that this case has afforded anyone," Holmes replied, with a gravity I had rarely seen him display regarding the human consequences of his work. "And I confess I am glad, Watson, that our efforts furnished her at least that much, however little it can restore to her what she truly lost." Of Silas Crane I will say only that he left behind a widow and 2 young children, for whom Holmes, with a discretion that I learned of only by chance some considerable time afterward, arranged a modest but sufficient annuity from his own resources, a kindness he never once mentioned to me directly, and which I record here only because I believe it speaks more truly to the man's essential nature than any account of his deductive brilliance, however celebrated, ever could. Chapter 16. What the Earth Gives Back. It was some weeks after the trial's conclusion, upon an evening when the autumn fog had once again settled thick and yellow over Baker Street, that Holmes and I sat together before our fire, he with his pipe and a volume of monographs upon some obscure point of toxicology, I with the evening paper, in the particular companionable silence that had grown, over years of shared lodgings, into one of the great comforts of my life. "I have been reflecting, Watson," he said at length, setting aside his book, "upon the peculiar manner in which this case began, with the ground itself giving way beneath a street that has stood, to all outward appearance, entirely unchanged for the better part of a century. There is something in that, I think, worth remarking upon." "You mean the irony of progress unearthing what greed had thought safely buried?" "I mean something more than irony, Watson, though irony is certainly present. I mean that this city of ours is forever digging into its own past, whether through the deliberate industry of an engineer's tunnel or through the slower, equally relentless excavation of time and conscience, and that whatever men bury beneath its streets, whether bodies or secrets, or the small accumulated weight of their own unconfessed crimes, has a curious tendency to surface again, sooner or later, when the world has need of it. Pemberton believed, I think, that 2 years of undisturbed silence had rendered his secret permanent. He had not reckoned with the Metropolitan Railway Company's ambitions for a new connecting spur, nor with the patience of a Scotland Yard inspector who happened to recall a name half forgotten from an old case file, nor, I will allow myself to say without excessive immodesty, with the particular curiosity of a consulting detective who happened to live but a few hundred yards from where the ground gave way. "You make it sound almost providential," I said, smiling. "I make no claim to providence, Watson, only to observation, which is, after all, the whole of my trade. Men bury their crimes believing the earth will keep their secrets as faithfully as they themselves have learned to keep them. But the earth, I find, is a poor confederate for villainy. It shifts, it settles, it is dug into, sooner or later, by engineers in search of a railway line, or by detectives in search of a truth. And what it has held in patient darkness, it gives back, in its own time, to the light." He drew upon his pipe for a moment, gazing into the fire with that distant expression that I had learned, over years of friendship, to recognize as the sign of a mind already turning toward some new question, some fresh perplexity that the ordinary world had not yet brought to our door. "And now, Watson," he said, with a sudden return of his more characteristic energy, "I believe Mrs. Hudson has left us a quite excellent supper waiting below, and I confess that 2 weeks spent copying ledgers, as the unfortunate Mr. Forsyth has left me with a healthy appetite for both food and for whatever fresh problem London's 8 million souls may next see fit to lay before us. Shall we go down?" And so we did, leaving behind us, for that evening at least, the cold patience of Aldous Pemberton's 2-year deception, and the quiet, hard-won peace it had finally, if imperfectly, brought to those it had wronged, content, as I have so often been content in Holmes's company, to let the next mystery announce itself in its own time, as London's mysteries always eventually do. The end.